Hello and welcome to the May edition of Huttered Histories. This month we have Great War enthusiast and writer Carole Hope, who's going to be telling us all about her First World War writing and her new book, which has recently been published, called Frank Speaking. Carole, welcome to Great War Huts.
Thank you very much, Taff. I'm very pleased to be here.
That's great. Okay, so right from the start then, what got you interested in the First World War, and what sparked that interest, and what got you into writing about the First World War and the people who took part?
Well, really, it was just a process of evolution, really. History was always my favourite subject at school, along with writing. I've always been a writer of one sort or another. I used to like writing essays at school. I used to like writing thank you cards to relatives. And then a bit later on in life, I decided to study for a degree with the Open University. Majoring mostly in history, and the last module for that degree centred on the First and Second World Wars. It wasn't military history, it was more the social and political background to the wars, but then I decided I'd like to find out a bit more about the military side.
Fascinating. No, I mean it's. I mean nowadays it's. You know, there's a lot of women who are writing about military history. There's a lot of military historians, but certainly going back into the past, it wasn't that common, was it? Were you unusual, do you think, from that point of view of having that interest at the time?
Do you know, I don't really know, Taff. I was certainly very unusual amongst my circle of friends and family, that's for sure. Yeah. And when I first started getting into it, of course, there was no social media or anything, so who knows. Having said that, the degree course I took, the last module of it, there were a fair number of females in the group, so yeah. Yeah.
And family history, I mean, did you have any family members who served during the First World War?
Well, I did, except for I didn't find out about them until after I'd started getting interested in the subject independently of that. It was subsequent to my interest that I found out about the family members, yes.
And were there quite a few of them, or?
Well, so far we've identified, me and my partner have identified 3. Yep. My mum told me about the first one, a great uncle that was actually killed on the 1st of October 1917, and he's on the memorial at Tyne-Cot. And in recent times we found out that he had actually had 2 brothers that also served, and both survived.
Great. That's. I mean, personally, I mean, whilst my interest really sort of started with collecting uniforms and equipment, but quite early on I discovered that my grandfather had served in the First World War, and the minute that you make that connection, it certainly then pushes you along on the journey, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, your first book about Father Willie Doyle, how did that come about?
It came about because I was given a copy of the original biography written about him, which was published in 1919. And this biography was written by a fellow Jesuit priest, and 3/4 of it centred on his religious life. But then the little bit at the back, that focused on his military career, I found absolutely fascinating. I actually read that, whereas the rest of it I kind of just skimmed through. And I decided that he sounded absolutely fascinating. I'd always wanted to write a book. I always thought it would be fiction. I'd previously taken a course in creative writing, but never really got that spark for a novel. And then so I decided, well, you know, I've got all the information here. I just have to craft my own writing around what's already there.
Brilliant. That's fascinating. And was that well received?
Yeah, I think so. The problem with it is that I broke all the rules. You know, the people said to me, you need to focus on one audience, either the religious audience or the military audience. And I kind of ignored that, and I tried to cater for both. So it really fell between two stools. And it was also extremely long. I should never have published as big a book as that. But I mean, I think I sold about 300 copies.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know where you would put that on the Richter scale, if you like, of success.
I mean, it's a success just to publish it, isn't it? Really? I think that's it's a great thing to do.
I mean, I'm immensely proud of the fact that 300 people have got a book that I wrote.
Yeah.
So yeah,
super. Well, let's hope that the same will be true of your latest book, which is Frank Speaking: From Suvla to Schweidnitz. So this time, this book, how did this one come about?
Well, while I was researching and writing the Father Doyle book, Frank Laird's name came up a few times when I was researching secondary sources. So, for example, there's an Irish historian and writer called Miles Dungan, who's published a couple of volumes of short histories where he takes a certain story and elaborates on that, and then moves on to the next one. So Frank Laird came up a couple of times in that. So then you Google, of course, and you find that there is actually a memoir that was published after his death, but it was an unfinished memoir published by his wife following his death. And I don't know how many copies she published, but I wouldn't say probably more than about a dozen, because it's extremely rare, and when it does come up for sale, it's quite expensive.
And is that one there?
And yes, this is a gift to me from my partner Andrew Tong. And so as soon as I acquired this, I thought, well, you know, this has got to be the next project.
Brilliant. That's lovely. So tell us about Frank. Tell us a bit about about his life, and because clearly it's something that sparked you, and you thought it was a story worth telling. Yeah.
Frank Laird was a civil servant in his mid-30s, very mild-mannered, he was described as by a contemporary. He worked for the Dublin Metropolitan Police Court. And when war broke out, his initial thought was that war wasn't for him. He couldn't be a soldier. But then as the months went on, he started to change his mind. And then on the very last day of 1914, he found himself at the Curragh camp,
yes.
Having enlisted with the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, having first, as he put it, put his affairs in order. And putting his affairs in order was that he got engaged to get married, and he had an operation done for varicose veins.
And that was his preparation for war?
That was his preparation, yeah.
So at this stage he's just an ordinary soldier?
He's just an ordinary private soldier, yeah. And after training at the Curragh, they then go on to Royal Barracks in Dublin, they then go on to Basingstoke, and eventually they embark at Devonport on board the Alunia to make the voyage to Gallipoli.
This isn't the initial attack on the 25th of April, is it?
This is the 7th of August 1915. He landed on Gallipoli, and on the 9th of August, 2 days later, he was actually wounded. So the wound was severe enough for him to be evacuated, but not severe enough that he didn't make a recovery. So he then recovered, was sent on home duty to the Royal Barracks in Dublin, and whilst there, on Easter Monday 1916, he had a day off and he was going to have a walk in the Dublin mountains with some chums when news of the uprising came. So he then started making his way back to the Royal Barracks and was told by a soldier, you better not go any further because there's really intense fighting going on. And of course he didn't have uniform or weapon or anything. So he was diverted to the Wellington Barracks, and he actually spent the rest of the rising at Wellington Barracks. And during that time he was made corporal. At the beginning of 1917, he's now got his commission in January, and he lands in France at Calais, spends less than 24 hours at Etaples, and then makes his way to join the 8th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who are billeted in the Kemmel area. So now his career is a process of being in the battalion, rotating between the frontline trenches, in the Messines sector, back to Kemmel, Locker, etc. Going on various courses to enhance his career and acquire new skills.
So this is very much that sort of quiet time. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of people have the idea that it's fighting all the time,
Yeah.
but a lot of the time it is just
Yeah.
trench routine and
Absolutely.
going on courses. And,
Absolutely, yeah. And a feature of his writing during this time is just describing what he calls a cushy course or a nice day out in Ballyhooly, as they called
Yes,
it,
yeah.
and buying perfume for his wife and having a nice dinner somewhere, you know. So yes, very much so. Then of course we have the preparation for the Battle of Messines, and for that battle he was actually balloted out of the action.
Oh, that was fortunate.
Yeah, so he
and that basically means that there's a decision to leave some of the officers out of the action and some of the NCOs in case there's heavy casualties, so there's something to build on.
Exactly.
And he's one of the lucky ones to draw one of those tickets.
Exactly, he's one of the lucky ones. Yeah, and this is actually where the memoir has a gap. So we now have a gap in the memoir between the end of the Battle of Messines until when he goes back to France at the beginning of 1918. So this gap is covered by me with reference to the battalion war diaries, and also some of Father Doyle's letters, because Father Doyle covered all of this time period, and he was attached to the 8th Royal Dublin Fusiliers.
Oh, interesting. So the two stories come together.
So the two stories come together. So if I just keep on the timeline, after the Battle of Messines, they're then sent for training to the Pas de Calais for the Third Deep, 31st of July start. And of course they'd already been to the Pas de Calais previously for training for Messines. So for that period, it's totally different when he gets back from training. It's totally different to life leading up to the Battle of Messines. They are now, they're really in the thick of it, because although they didn't take part in the opening offensive on the 31st of July, they were attached to 15th Division and 55th Division for carrying and burial duties following their offensive on the 31st of July. So that would have kept them very busy. So it would have kept them very busy. And so they were constantly in rotation between the front line, because 55th Division and 15th Division were taken out of the front line after the initial assault. So the 8th Royal Dublin Fusiliers were rotating between the front line and the camps behind the line, but also carrying out duties of one sort or another. And it's during this period, prior to the 16th of August assault, Frank sustained his second wound from shrapnel, and he was hit in the head this time. So again, he's evacuated back to England, goes through the process of recovery, and then reports back for duty to France in January 1918. And this time he's attached to an entrenching battalion working on the Péronne railway.
So was that because he'd been slightly medically downgraded, do you think? Do you think that after having had 2 wounds they decide that he's going to have a slightly easier time, or just that his services weren't needed with the 8th, there were already other people?
I think it's probably a combination of the two. I mean, there's no actual evidence to say that he was downgraded for duty because of his wound, but you know, that does sound very believable. And it was also the fact that at this time brigades were downgraded, yes, weren't they, from yes. From 4 battalions yeah. to 3. So there weren't as many men needed for the actual battalion. So he was sent to an entrenching battalion who were working on the railway based around Péronne when the Germans started their spring offensive. Yeah. So to begin with, Frank and his entrenching battalion chums were quite blasé about it. They didn't really think that much of it, and then the situation of course deteriorated, and they were attached to a Canadian company, and on the night, I think it was the 23rd of March, the Canadians decided it's too hot here and off they went, leaving the Royal Dublin Fusiliers that had been attached to them. So they then decided, well, what they must do is try and rejoin their battalion, who they knew were in the sector somewhere, and they thought they were round about Bray. So they started retreating back across the old Somme battlefields to try and locate their battalion. And en route, they met up with a captain of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers and a major of the Hampshire Regiment, the pioneering regiment that are attached to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and joined up with them and then started advancing towards the Germans. And eventually they engaged with the Germans, and Frank was wounded again. And in fact, most of the men he was with at the time were either wounded or killed outright by the Germans in that action. So he was taken prisoner of war. Yeah.
So he's not had a great deal of luck, has he? Although yeah, it could have been much worse.
It could have been much worse, yeah. So he was treated, patched up. And then eventually he ended up at the hospital, makeshift hospital at Le Cateau. And then after they decided that he was fit enough to travel, he was packed off on a train to prisoner of war camp. So the first prisoner of war camp he went to was Hammerstein, stayed a few weeks there. Then that was overcrowded, so some of them were shipped out from there. They then spent some time at another place at Rastatt, if that's how it's pronounced, I don't know. And then in June 1918 he found himself at Schweidnitz, which is where he spent the rest of the war.
And was that a fairly, I mean obviously he was an officer, so presumably they had a reasonably comfortable time
They
there.
did seem to have a reasonably comfortable time, yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting though that even though they had a fairly comfortable time, there were still attempts at escapes, and so he does tell a couple of tales of attempts at escapes that unfortunately came to nothing.
And was that him? Was he trying to escape, or was he?
No.
He wasn't part. Yeah, because
No.
there seems to have been quite a hierarchy with escapers. That, you know, the people who've been here longest get the first go.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. And I don't know if the wound that he sustained when he was taken prisoner may have incapacitated him, because his first wound was, I don't know which way round I'm getting this, but the first wound in Gallipoli was his left side and affected his rib cage and his lungs, and then the third wound was a bullet in his right side. So whether that may have had some overall effect over his overall fitness, I don't know.
And so then presumably the 11th of November 1918 rolls around, and suddenly the POWs are just released, and did he have to make his own way home? How did that work out?
Oh no, it was all done, you know, with typical both German and British efficiency, in that they were in train to Danzig, and then by ship from Danzig to do you know, I've forgotten where it is now, but somewhere in Scotland that they
Leith?
Yes,
yeah,
Leith.
Yeah, a lot of them seem to have gone to Leith.
Yeah. So, and then from Leith they were sent to a camp, obviously, to go through the process of demobilisation and checking their health and all the rest of it. Yeah.
And the officers all seem to have been court-martialed for being captured and then having to answer, and normally then finding that there was no problem. Did he have to go through that process too?
Well, I don't know if it was court-martial as such, but certainly he had to write an account on an official form of the circumstances of his capture, and then of course he gets a letter a few weeks later to say, oh, that's okay.
That's all right. You've been wounded and captured, that's all right.
We'll let you off, kind of thing. Yeah. So, I mean, just to recap it a little bit, the memoir starts again. The gap was after the Battle of Messines, and started again when he went to France in 1918. And the reason why there's a gap, other than of course he died, but the reason why it's structured like that is because the memoir came about because he was asked post-war to give a talk to the local branch of the Old Comrades Association about his experiences as a prisoner of war. So obviously he wrote up notes to help him with this talk about his capture and his experiences as a prisoner of war. Then, having done that, his wife then said to him, well, you know, you should write from the beginning and tell the whole story. So he went back to the beginning, started writing up the whole story, but unfortunately his health failed and he died before he could finish it, hence the gap.
You had the beginning and the end, but he didn't quite finish the bit in the
exactly,
middle. Fascinating, yes. Exactly. So when he came out of the army, did he go back to his previous job?
Yes, he went back to the civil service in Dublin, the memoir actually ends when he disembarks at Leith, but I've put an epilogue in my book to say where he was demobilised and the process that they had to go through, and just touched on the conditions back in Dublin for returning soldiers, but not too much detail.
And how soon after the war did he die?
He died at the very end of 1925. From his wife says in her preface to this book that it was as a result of his war service, but I actually got a copy of the death certificate and it seems that he had bowel cancer.
Oh, poor old boy. Well, that's absolutely fascinating, and it's lovely, isn't it? Because, as always with memoirs, especially long forgotten ones, suddenly these people are just brought back to the surface again, and their lives are suddenly put back in the spotlight, and I think that's a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Well, as soon as I got this as a gift, there were a couple of things that struck me about it. And the first thing that struck me about it was exactly the same thing that struck me about Father Doyle, in that they're both very good writers. They're both very engaging writers. The Father Doyle book was based on letters that he actually wrote at the time during the course of his war service. This one is a memoir written afterwards, but they're in their own way, in their own different ways, they are very engaging writers. So, you know, it's a pleasure to read.
Yes.
It's not just the fact that you find out stuff about the war and what some men went through. It is the fact that he is a very engaging writer, and you do enjoy reading it.
Yeah, so literally a pleasure to read about it as well.
Yeah, and the other thing that struck me was that, you know, despite the unfinished element of it, it is a memoir that I think deserves a wider audience. You know, you hear so many people say, "What's your favourite memoir of the First World War?" "Oh, well, you can't beat this one, and you can't beat that one, and my favourite is this one." And you know, he just hasn't got a voice. He hasn't got an audience. Whereas, you know, hopefully now.
Brilliant.
He will have.
That's super. That's absolutely brilliant. So if people want to get a copy of Frank Speaking, where can they get hold of a copy?
Right, now that is a tricky one, insofar as I'm not putting it on Amazon or anything, or not yet anyway. I might in the future, I don't know. So I could leave you an email address.
Certainly. So if people want a copy, if they get in contact with Great War Huts, we can pass it on. You'd be happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, most of the copies I've sold so far, people have paid through PayPal, and they need my email address for that anyway. So it's not a problem giving out my email address. So yeah, just email me, or if you are on Twitter, I'm on Twitter and Facebook. On Twitter, I'm at Carole1418, which is Carole with an E.
And easy enough to find. And as I say, certainly if you can't find her anywhere else, certainly you can come to Great War Huts, and we will definitely put you in touch with Carole so that you can get a copy. Well, that has been absolutely fascinating.
And you're welcome.
And I just think it's lovely that you know, so twice now you've taken these characters and given them a voice again. And I think that's a lovely thing to do.
And the Father Doyle one, I'll just add the Father Doyle one, I do actually intend to reissue it and cut it right back, and this time focus only on the military side. Yeah. And
leave the Jesuit bit to the original copy.
So hopefully with a half a size book, I might get, you know, an audience for that as well. We'll see.
That's brilliant. Well, Carole Hope, thank you very much indeed for coming and for sharing Frank's story with us. That's all there is for this month. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us for another episode of Hutted Histories, and I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. Next month, do join us again for the June talk, and in the meantime, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the Great War Huts YouTube channel, where all of these talks are available. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.